Far away from the bustling cities, hidden deep within the mountains, there was a place that no one had ever seen. A place so secret that even the people who lived nearby did not know it existed. Thick forests and rocky cliffs surrounded it, hiding it from view. This was not just any ordinary building. It was a laboratory. A laboratory where experiments had been carried out for over 200 years. Inside, the walls were cold and metallic, with tubes, wires, and machines humming quietly. Strange lights flickered in the darkness. Scientists moved silently, taking notes and checking on things that no human had ever seen before. For generations, this lab had been working in secrecy. Its purpose was a mystery to the world outside. The creatures inside the lab were not normal. They were strange beings, unlike anything seen before. Some had features similar to animals, but their eyes were intelligent, watching everything carefully. Others could change their shape slightly, adapting to the environment around them. Over the centuries, they had grown stronger, smarter, and faster because of the experiments. They were lab subjects, but they were far more than that. The lab was isolated for a reason. The experiments were dangerous, and the scientists wanted no interference. Rumors said that long ago, the first humans to enter the lab had been amazed and terrified. They could not believe what they saw. But after that, the lab was locked away, forgotten by the outside world, continuing its secret work. Outside, the mountains were calm. Birds flew overhead, and the wind whispered through the trees. But inside, life was different. The creatures had been studied and observed, day after day, century after century. They had never known freedom. Their world was small, confined to glass walls and metal cages. Still, they were not weak. They had survived the experiments, adapted to the strange environment, and learned to understand the humans who studied them. Some of the scientists had grown curious about their subjects. They would watch quietly, noticing small changes. One creature, a small fox-like being with glowing blue eyes, had begun to understand the humans' gestures. It could imitate certain movements and even anticipate what the scientists would do next. Another, larger creature with long limbs, had shown problem-solving skills, figuring out how to escape from locked enclosures, only to be caught again. Despite all the control the scientists had, the creatures were not completely powerless. Deep inside, in their eyes and minds, a spark of intelligence grew with every passing century. They remembered the faces of humans, the sounds of machines, the patterns of the experiments. They were learning, slowly but surely. The lab itself was enormous. It had multiple floors, each dedicated to different kinds of studies. There were rooms filled with plants, rooms filled with strange chemicals, and even chambers where the air itself was controlled. Everything was monitored, recorded, and analyzed. The scientists were meticulous. They believed that in time, their work would unlock secrets that could change humanity forever. But not everything went as planned. Occasionally, the creatures would behave in unexpected ways. One day, a small group of them managed to work together to move a heavy object blocking a door. Another day, a creature would refuse to follow instructions, simply because it wanted to see what would happen if it didn't. These small acts of defiance were never punished severely, because the scientists were fascinated. They wanted to understand how the creatures thought, how they reacted to challenges. Outside the lab, the world continued its ordinary life. People went about their days, unaware that hidden in the mountains, a secret experiment had been ongoing for centuries. They did not know that these creatures existed, or that they had grown far beyond what anyone could imagine. The lab was like a bubble of time, untouched by the outside world. Inside, the creatures had their own ways of communicating. Some used sounds, others gestures, and some even subtle changes in color or shape. They had developed a silent language that humans did not understand. It was a language built over generations, a language of survival and intelligence. The scientists, meanwhile, continued their work with dedication. They kept journals, wrote reports, and sometimes argued about the ethics of their experiments. Some believed they were doing the right thing for science. Others quietly wondered if they had gone too far. But all agreed that the world outside must never know. The lab's secrecy was absolute. One stormy night, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the mountains in bright white. Inside the lab, the creatures huddled in their enclosures, watching the shadows and lights flicker across the walls. The humans worked tirelessly, unaware of the storm outside. The lab was a world of its own, a world separated from nature, from society, from the rest of humanity. And yet, something had begun to change. Small cracks appeared in the strict control the scientists had. A creature noticed a loose panel in its enclosure. Another watched a human drop a key and learned how to pick it up. The spark of curiosity, long suppressed, was awakening. The creatures were beginning to wonder about the world outside. The world beyond the cold metal walls. The lab, after 200 years, was not just a place of science anymore. It was a place of mystery, intelligence, and life. The humans believed they were in control, but the creatures were learning, growing, and waiting. Waiting for a day when they might see the sun, breathe the fresh air, and explore the world they had been denied for centuries. In the heart of the hidden lab, under the watchful eyes of the scientists, history was being written. Not the history of humans, but the history of the creatures who had survived, adapted, and grown beyond anyone's imagination. And though the world outside remained unaware, change was quietly building inside the hidden lab, preparing for the moment when humans and their creations would finally meet. The secret of the hidden lab was no longer just about science. It was about life, intelligence, and the unknown. And soon, very soon, humans would discover it, and everything inside it. Inside the hidden lab, life continued in quiet secrecy. The creatures that had been kept there for centuries were no ordinary beings. Each one was unique, with features that seemed both familiar and strange. Some looked like animals, but their eyes revealed a depth of intelligence that surprised even the most experienced scientists. Others had shapes that could shift slightly, adapting to the conditions of their environment. Over generations, they had evolved, not through nature, but through careful, deliberate experimentation. The scientists referred to them as subjects, a word that seemed simple, but did not capture their complexity. The subjects had memories, instincts, and even emotions. Some were playful, enjoying small games with each other. Others were quiet and observant, studying the humans who worked in the lab. These creatures had been born, grown, and survived entirely within the cold, metallic walls of the lab. They knew nothing of the outside world, and yet, they were beginning to wonder. One of the subjects, a small fox-like creature with silver fur and bright blue eyes, had a special gift. It could watch a human perform a task and learn it quickly. The scientists were fascinated by its ability to understand patterns and anticipate their actions. They often left puzzles or small challenges for it, observing how it responded. Sometimes it succeeded, and sometimes it failed, but each time, it learned. Over centuries, this ability had grown, making it almost human in its cleverness. Another subject, larger and stronger, had long limbs and a body that could stretch and bend in ways that humans could not. It was more cautious than the fox-like creature, studying every movement of the scientists before acting. When it first appeared in the lab, it had been wild and unpredictable. But over generations of careful observation and selective experimentation, it had become disciplined, capable of thinking several steps ahead. Yet beneath its obedience, a spark of rebellion had begun to grow. The subjects communicated in ways humans did not fully understand. Some used sounds, clicks, and growls. Others relied on gestures or changes in color or shape. Over time, they had created a silent language, a network of signals that allowed them to share knowledge, warn each other, or even play tricks on the scientists. Though the humans were curious, they could not grasp the depth of the subjects' understanding. The creatures were more than just experiments, they were thinkers, learners, and survivors. Every day, the lab tested them in new ways. Some tests were simple, solving puzzles, recognizing shapes, or following instructions. Others were more complex, requiring the subjects to work together or adapt to new environments. The humans believed that these tests would reveal the limits of the subjects' abilities. But the creatures often surprised them. The fox-like one, for instance, learned to anticipate the movement of a robotic arm, using it to reach objects that should have been impossible to reach. The larger one began to understand cause and effect, manipulating levers and doors in ways that the scientists had never predicted. Despite their confinement, the subjects were not unhappy. Their world was limited, yes, but it was also full of stimuli, challenges, and interactions. Some had formed bonds with each other, small families or groups that worked together for mutual benefit. Others seemed to enjoy observing the humans, perhaps understanding them in a way the humans did not understand themselves. Over generations, these bonds had become stronger, creating a network of intelligence and cooperation that the scientists could only partially comprehend. The lab itself had been designed to observe and influence them. Some chambers had plants, water, or controlled weather conditions. Others were filled with strange chemicals or lights that could alter the creature's behavior. Every detail was planned, every variable tested. Yet no matter how careful the scientists were, the subjects adapted. They learned the rhythms of the humans, the patterns of the machines, and even the quirks of the lab itself. They were becoming more than just subjects, they were evolving. One day, a group of subjects discovered something new. A small vent, partially hidden behind a panel, allowed them to hear sounds from a distant part of the lab. They listened, learning about humans they had never seen. They began to experiment with the vent, creating small changes in their movements or sounds to see how the humans reacted. The scientists noticed some unusual behavior but could not understand the full extent of what was happening. The creatures were always one step ahead, quietly learning and observing. The subjects' intelligence was growing, but so was their curiosity. For the first time in generations, they began to wonder about the world outside. What lay beyond the lab walls? What was the sky like? What did sunlight feel like? These questions had no answers in their confined world, yet the spark of curiosity had been ignited. They watched the humans leave and enter, trying to imagine the life beyond the doors. Over time, some subjects began to plan, not rebellions, but small experiments of their own. They tested how far they could move without being noticed, how they could interact without being caught. Every action, every thought, strengthened their minds and their understanding of the world. Despite their intelligence, the subjects were still creatures of habit. They followed routines, observed rules, and learned from failures. But deep inside, they were beginning to think differently. They remembered the experiments, the humans, and the patterns of the lab. They learned not just from the tests but from each other. Over centuries, this created a level of awareness that the scientists could not predict. The lab had tried to control them, but it had also created something unexpected: minds capable of independent thought, curiosity, and even creativity. The scientists noticed these changes with a mixture of awe and concern. Some believed that the subjects were reaching new levels of intelligence, approaching something close to human understanding. Others worried that the creatures might one day surpass them, that the centuries of control might end, and that the lab could lose its power. But for now, the creatures remained confined, observing, learning, and waiting. Even in their confinement, the subjects had personalities. Some were bold, testing the limits of their cages. Others were quiet, calculating, and patient. Some were playful, enjoying simple games with each other or with the humans. And some were wise, seeming to understand far more than their environment allowed them to express. Over generations, these traits had become deeply rooted, creating a community of creatures that was more than just the sum of its parts. And so, life in the hidden lab continued. The subjects learned, observed, and adapted. The humans studied, recorded, and experimented. 2 centuries of careful planning had created a world inside the lab that was separate from the outside. But the subjects were no longer just passive creations. They were thinkers, learners, and observers. They were alive, intelligent, and aware. And somewhere, deep in their minds, the spark of curiosity continued to grow. The questions about the world beyond the lab, about the humans who controlled them, about life outside their confinement, these questions would not be silenced. One day, perhaps, the subjects would act on them. One day, they would discover the truth of the world beyond their cages. But for now, they waited, watched, and learned. The hidden lab was alive with quiet activity. Machines hummed softly, lights flickered, and the faint scent of chemicals filled the air. Every corner of the lab had a purpose, every machine a task. And at the center of it all were the experiments. For 200 years, humans had been conducting studies on the creatures, trying to understand, improve, and sometimes control them. The experiments were not simple. They were carefully designed, each one pushing the subject's abilities further. Some focused on intelligence, testing the creature's problem-solving skills. Others focused on strength, speed, or senses. And some experiments were unusual, designed to see how the creatures would adapt to changes in their environment. The humans believed that through these experiments, they could unlock secrets of evolution and life itself. One room, called the cognition chamber, was filled with puzzles. Objects, levers, and glowing shapes were arranged in intricate patterns. The fox-like creature with silver fur often worked there. At first, it struggled, sometimes failing to complete even simple tasks. But over years of repetition, its mind grew sharper. It began to recognize patterns quickly, predicting the results of each move. The scientists watched, amazed. They had created something extraordinary, a being capable of learning faster than any human had anticipated. Another chamber focused on physical adaptation. The larger, long-limbed creature was placed in environments that challenged its strength and flexibility. The floor would tilt, obstacles would appear, and the lighting would change suddenly. Each experiment tested its reflexes, balance, and decision-making. Sometimes the creature failed. Sometimes it succeeded. And with each failure, it learned. With each success, it grew stronger. The humans kept careful records, noting every detail, but they did not realize the creatures were also learning about them, observing their methods, anticipating their actions. There were also experiments that tested cooperation. Groups of creatures were given tasks that required teamwork. Some needed to lift objects together, others had to solve puzzles that required communication. Over generations, the subjects developed subtle ways to communicate, using gestures, sounds, and even changes in color or shape. The humans could observe some of this, but they did not fully understand the depth of the subjects' interactions. What the humans saw as simple obedience, the creatures experienced as strategy, planning, and collaboration. Not all experiments were physical or mental. Some were designed to test emotional responses. Scientists observed how creatures reacted to fear, joy, or surprise. Some subjects would comfort each other after a stressful experiment. Others would play small games that seemed to be purely for enjoyment. These emotional studies fascinated the humans. They were beginning to realize that the creatures were not simple lab animals. They were intelligent, aware, and capable of feelings. Yet, despite the centuries of testing, the creatures were far from broken. They had endured harsh conditions, repeated trials, and strict schedules. Some humans believed this would make them obedient. But the subjects had developed resilience. They learned to anticipate the experiments, sometimes even manipulating the outcomes. The fox-like creature learned to trick the scientists occasionally, performing a task in a slightly different way to see what would happen. The larger one began testing the boundaries of its cages, subtly moving objects or doors when the humans were not looking. The lab's experiments were also about discovery. The humans wanted to understand not just the creatures, but the limits of life itself. They studied their biology, their intelligence, their adaptability. Each experiment added to a growing pool of knowledge that had been collected over centuries. And yet, the creatures were not passive. They observed, adapted, and learned in return. With every test, their minds became sharper, their bodies stronger, and their awareness deeper. Some experiments had unexpected results. One day, a small group of creatures figured out how to work together to manipulate a complex machine in the lab. The humans were stunned. They had never imagined that the subjects could understand cause and effect at such a level. Another experiment involved changing the lighting and air pressure in a chamber. Instead of being intimidated, the creatures adapted quickly, moving with grace and efficiency, even in the altered conditions. Over time, these surprises became more frequent. The subjects were no longer just participants, they were active problem solvers, testing their own limits. Ethics were a quiet concern for some of the scientists. A few wondered if they had gone too far. They debated quietly about the morality of their work. Was it right to confine such intelligent creatures for experiments? Was it fair to test them relentlessly for centuries? But most of the team focused on the science, fascinated by the results, driven by the knowledge that no human before them had ever achieved such discoveries. Despite the complexity, there was one rule in the lab: humans controlled the environment. Doors could open or close, air and temperature could change, food could be given or withheld. And yet, even in this controlled space, the creatures found ways to adapt. They learned when humans were likely to enter a room. They observed patterns in feeding, cleaning, and testing. Slowly, quietly, they began to understand not just the experiments, but the humans themselves. Curiosity began to grow in the subjects, a curiosity that even the scientists could not predict. They looked at the lab walls, the cages, and the machines, wondering what lay beyond. What was outside the cold, metallic walls? What was the world like beyond the mountains? These questions were new, and they brought a quiet energy to the subjects. They were beginning to think in ways that were not just reactive, they were planning, imagining, and dreaming. Over the centuries, the experiments had created something remarkable. The humans thought they were shaping the creatures, controlling their development. But in truth, the subjects had shaped themselves as much as the humans shaped them. They had survived, adapted, and grown beyond the limits of the experiments. Every challenge, every test, had made them stronger, smarter, and more aware. The lab continued, as it had for 200 years. Machines hummed, lights flickered, and the scientists moved quietly from room to room, conducting experiments. The creatures watched, learned, and adapted. The experiments were not just tests, they were lessons, opportunities, and challenges. And the subjects, with their growing intelligence and curiosity, were learning more than the humans had ever expected. Somewhere deep in their minds, the spark of independence was growing. They began to imagine possibilities outside the lab, ways to explore, and ways to act. The experiments had created life, intelligence, and awareness. And soon, perhaps, they would create something even more extraordinary: freedom. The humans believed they were in control. But the subjects had learned too much, adapted too well, and grown too strong. The experiments, meant to test limits, had created minds capable of exceeding them. And as the machines hummed, and the lights flickered, the hidden lab became not just a place of study, but a place where history was quietly shifting. For 2 centuries, the hidden lab had remained untouched by the outside world. The mountains around it were thick and wild, protecting the secret within. The humans who ran the experiments believed their work was completely isolated, and for generations, it had been. But change was coming. Something small, almost unnoticed, began to ripple outward, eventually reaching humans beyond the lab. It started with reports from nearby villages, far from the mountains. Hunters and travelers spoke of strange lights flickering in the sky at night, odd sounds carried by the wind, and glimpses of creatures that did not match any known animal. Most people dismissed these stories as superstition or exaggeration. Yet, the whispers continued, growing more frequent and more detailed. Birds acted strangely around certain areas, and livestock sometimes disappeared without explanation. Something unusual was happening, and humans were beginning to notice. Inside the lab, the creatures sensed the change too. Their intelligence, sharpened by generations of experiments, allowed them to perceive the world beyond their cages in ways humans could not understand. The fox-like creature with silver fur had begun paying attention to the humans' patterns differently. It noticed that some doors opened rarely, and sometimes humans left equipment unattended. The larger, long-limbed creature observed sounds and vibrations in the walls, trying to locate the source of the disturbance. The lab had always been their world, but now the edges of that world seemed to be expanding. The first human to actively investigate was a young scientist from outside the lab's research organization, named Dr. Elena Rivas. She had been sent to the region to study unusual energy readings that had been detected in the mountains. When she arrived, she noticed a pattern in the reports from villagers: strange lights, missing animals, and unexplained noises. Something was definitely happening, but she had no idea it led to the hidden lab. Dr. Rivas was careful. She did not want to alarm the local population or alert anyone who might misuse the discovery. Using small drones and sensors, she began to map the mountains quietly. Days turned into weeks as she followed faint trails and strange signals. One night, under the light of a full moon, her drone captured something incredible: a structure partially hidden by cliffs and dense forest. Lights glimmered from inside, and faint movements suggested life, but not the life of ordinary animals. Inside the lab, the creatures noticed the drones immediately. They had never seen anything like them. Small sensors hovered in the air, making soft buzzing noises, and the creatures instinctively reacted. The fox-like one darted behind a metal panel, watching carefully. The larger creature positioned itself near the door, ready to act if necessary. For centuries, they had only known the humans in the lab. Now, something else was approaching: an outside human, someone who did not belong. When Dr. Rivas finally reached the lab's outer perimeter, she was both cautious and amazed. The forest seemed to resist her presence, thick roots and twisted branches slowing her progress, as if nature itself was guarding the secret. But she pushed forward, driven by curiosity and scientific duty. Every step brought her closer to something extraordinary, something that no human had seen for 200 years. Inside, the scientists noticed unusual activity among the subjects. Alarms were triggered, not by the humans' arrival, but by the creature's sudden alertness. They had sensed an intruder, an unknown human force in their world. The fox-like creature moved quickly, testing the limits of its enclosure, while the larger one adjusted its posture, ready to investigate or defend. The lab had always been under control, but for the first time in centuries, that control was being challenged from outside. Dr. Rivas, unaware of the creature's intelligence, slowly approached the lab's outer door. She examined the structure carefully, noting the advanced technology and the unusual design. The walls were thick, reinforced with materials that were far ahead of anything she had seen before. Sensors and cameras were embedded in the structure, all connected to a network that seemed centuries ahead of current science. Her heart raced as she realized she had stumbled upon something extraordinary: a hidden lab, untouched for generations, full of secrets no human had discovered. The first real encounter came unexpectedly. A small drone slipped too close to the lab's interior and caught the attention of the fox-like creature. It moved with astonishing speed, intercepting the drone and bringing it down without damaging it. Dr. Rivas watched in awe through her monitor. The creature's intelligence was far beyond what she had expected. It was not just reacting, it was thinking, planning, understanding consequences. For the first time, a human outside the lab had seen evidence of these extraordinary beings. Inside, the older scientists panicked. The lab had never been compromised, and the sudden presence of an outside human threatened 2 centuries of secrecy. They moved quickly, adjusting systems, attempting to contain the subjects, but the creatures were already observing the humans' actions. The larger creature, once thought to be fully obedient, now hesitated. It had learned patterns, observed behaviors, and was capable of making decisions independently. The balance of control in the lab was shifting. Dr. Rivas realized she could not simply leave. She needed to study the creatures directly. Carefully, she planned a controlled approach, using cameras and sensors to observe without being detected. She began documenting their behavior, noting the intelligence and adaptability displayed by the subjects. Each movement, each interaction, revealed creatures far beyond what science had imagined. Her excitement grew, tempered by caution. She knew that one wrong step could destroy the delicate balance inside the lab. The creatures, meanwhile, began to understand that these humans outside were different from those inside the lab. They were unpredictable, and their intentions were unknown. The fox-like creature studied Dr. Rivas carefully, watching how she moved, the tools she used, and the patterns in her behavior. The larger creature followed silently, a shadow in the background, ready to intervene if needed. For the first time, the lab's inhabitants realized that the world beyond their walls was real, and it was coming closer. By the end of the first week, Dr. Rivas had gathered enough evidence to confirm what she suspected. A hidden lab, home to creatures of extraordinary intelligence and strength, had existed for 2 centuries. The implications were staggering. Science, ethics, and human understanding were about to be challenged in ways no one could predict. And for the creatures, this was the beginning of a new chapter. They had survived centuries of experiments, adapted to an isolated world, and now faced the humans of the outside. The meeting of these 2 worlds was inevitable. As night fell over the mountains, the lab seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the creatures watched, the humans prepared, and the world outside began to awaken to a discovery that had been hidden for 200 years. The first contact had been made, and nothing would ever be the same. The hidden lab had been a secret for 200 years, and the creatures inside had never met humans from the outside world. Until now. Dr. Elena Rivas had discovered the lab, and her presence signaled the beginning of something extraordinary. But nothing could prepare either the humans or the creatures for the moment when they would finally face each other. The lab was alive with quiet tension. The fox-like creature with silver fur paced near its enclosure, ears twitching as it watched the humans move outside. The larger, long-limbed creature crouched in the shadows, its glowing eyes following every motion. For centuries, they had been subjects, observed and tested. They had learned, adapted, and survived. Now, they were about to encounter beings who were strangers, yet somehow part of the same world. Dr. Rivas moved cautiously. Her team had set up cameras and drones to observe before approaching directly, but she knew they had to see the lab for themselves. The outer doors were massive, reinforced with centuries-old metal, yet she could detect small openings, vents, and access points. Slowly, she opened a side panel, slipping inside with a careful step. The air was cool and metallic, filled with the faint hum of machinery. The lab smelled of chemicals and history, a place untouched for centuries. The creatures noticed immediately. The fox-like one darted behind a panel, watching with intelligence and caution. The larger one moved silently, its long limbs gliding across the floor. They had never seen humans act this way. The scientists inside the lab tried to control the situation, but it was impossible to predict how the subjects would react. For the first time, centuries of observation were met with uncertainty. Dr. Rivas stopped in the main chamber, her eyes scanning the room. Machines lined the walls, cages held creatures of incredible variety, and strange equipment hummed quietly. But her attention was drawn to the subjects themselves. They were watching her, each movement deliberate, calculated, intelligent. The fox-like creature stepped forward slowly, testing the humans, its eyes bright and curious. The larger one followed, keeping a careful distance, observing not just her, but the environment. The first words spoken were soft, cautious. Dr. Rivas introduced herself, trying to communicate that she meant no harm. The creatures did not respond in words, but their gestures and movements suggested understanding. They had learned from humans inside the lab for centuries, and now they could recognize similar patterns. A delicate balance of curiosity and caution hung in the air. One of the younger subjects, a bird-like creature with shimmering feathers, tilted its head, studying Dr. Rivas. It chirped softly, a sound that seemed almost like a greeting. The humans froze, unsure if this was a threat or an invitation. The fox-like creature approached, sniffing cautiously, and then retreated a few steps. Every movement was deliberate, as if testing the humans' intentions. The encounter was not violent, but it was electric with tension and intelligence. The humans inside the lab tried to regain control. They had believed their subjects were fully obedient, yet now, for the first time, the creatures acted independently. One moved a lever with precision, another tested a door mechanism. The humans realized that centuries of control had created beings capable of independent thought. The lab was no longer a place of simple experiments, it was a meeting of minds. Dr. Rivas took careful steps, showing no sudden movements. She placed a small piece of food on the floor, a gesture of peace. The fox-like creature approached cautiously, sniffing, and then took the offering. The larger one watched silently, its eyes bright with curiosity. Communication was tentative but possible. For the first time, humans and these extraordinary creatures were finding a way to connect. The lab itself seemed to hold its breath. Centuries of secrecy, study, and experimentation had led to this moment. The creatures moved with intelligence, the humans with caution, and for a brief moment, it felt like a bridge had been built between two worlds. The experiments, meant to test limits, had prepared the creatures to understand, to adapt, and now, to engage with humans from outside. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the back of the lab. A smaller subject had managed to unlock a cage using a lever mechanism, something the humans had never thought possible. It stepped out cautiously, joining the encounter. The humans were stunned. These creatures were not just intelligent, they were capable of problem-solving beyond expectation. Every moment revealed new depths to their abilities. Dr. Rivas realized that this encounter was historic. She documented everything carefully, knowing that the world outside could scarcely imagine what she had found. The creatures were more than experiments, they were a new form of life, shaped by centuries of human observation, yet independent and aware. Every movement, every sound, every glance was evidence of their intelligence. The fox-like creature now approached the humans directly, standing a few feet away. Its eyes met Dr. Rivas, and in that moment, there was understanding. The creatures were cautious, yet curious. They had survived 200 years of experiments, yet now they were engaging with humans not as subjects, but as equals in a shared space of awareness. The larger creature moved closer as well, its long limbs gliding silently across the floor. It observed the humans, noting their actions, their patterns, and their intentions. The lab, once a controlled environment, had become a meeting ground for two intelligent species. The humans were careful, recognizing the creature's capabilities, while the creatures tested the humans' intentions with intelligence and grace. For the first time, centuries of isolation had ended. The lab was no longer just a hidden place of science, it was a place of discovery, understanding, and potential. The encounter was peaceful, but charged with the tension of what could happen next. The humans realized that these creatures could not be contained easily. They were more capable than anyone had anticipated, and any action could provoke an unforeseen response. Dr. Rivas knelt slowly, showing a gesture of trust. The fox-like creature stepped closer, sniffed her hand, and then retreated slightly. The larger one observed silently, analyzing, learning, and understanding the new visitors. The other creatures began to gather, curious, cautious, and intelligent. The lab was alive in a way it had never been before, filled with energy, awareness, and possibility. The encounter lasted hours. Humans and creatures studied each other, learning patterns, gestures, and intentions. The creatures' intelligence, honed by centuries of experiments, allowed them to assess the humans quickly. They were not fearful, but neither were they fully trusting. And the humans, faced with beings of extraordinary capability, moved carefully, aware that any mistake could change everything. By the end of the day, a fragile understanding had been established. The humans had seen evidence of intelligence beyond their expectations. The creatures had observed humans as more than experimenters, they were beings with curiosity, thought, and intent. The encounter had shifted something fundamental. The lab was no longer simply a place of human control, it was a space where two forms of intelligence coexisted, cautiously aware of each other. As night fell over the mountains, the creatures returned to their enclosures, watching silently. The humans left the lab, carefully retracing their steps. The encounter had ended, but its impact lingered. The subjects had learned, observed, and adapted. The humans had discovered a new world hidden within the mountains. And both sides knew that this was only the beginning. For the first time in 2 centuries, the hidden lab had become a bridge between humans and extraordinary life forms. The encounter had shown that intelligence, awareness, and curiosity could exist in forms beyond what humans had imagined. And in the shadows, the spark of understanding between species had been lit, a spark that could change the course of history for both. The first encounter between humans and the lab's creatures had ended, but the hidden laboratory was far from calm. A new awareness had begun to awaken inside the creatures. They had studied the humans, learned their patterns, and realized that the world outside the lab was real, vast, and filled with unknown possibilities. Something deep inside them stirred, a spark of independence that had been suppressed for centuries. The fox-like creature paced near its enclosure, ears twitching and eyes alert. It had learned to recognize humans not as invaders or captors, but as beings of curiosity and intelligence. The larger, long-limbed creature studied the humans from the shadows, noticing details that even the scientists inside the lab had missed. Over generations, these creatures had been trained, tested, and observed. Now, they were beginning to make decisions on their own. The lab's older scientists sensed a shift. They had believed that centuries of experimentation had created obedience, but what they saw now was different. The creatures were not just following instructions, they were evaluating, planning, and reacting independently. For the first time, control seemed fragile. They tried to regain authority by reinforcing enclosures, locking doors, and increasing surveillance, but the subjects were already anticipating these moves. One night, a power fluctuation occurred in the lab. The fox-like creature noticed a panel that had been slightly loose for years. It nudged the panel, exploring the space behind it, and discovered a small maintenance passage. The larger creature followed, testing the limits of its strength against a door that had never been opened. The other subjects watched quietly, waiting for the right moment. The spark of rebellion, though careful and calculated, had begun. Dr. Reavers and her team were unaware of these developments. They had returned to observe, document, and study the creatures from a safe distance. They believed that a fragile trust had been established, and that the lab remained secure. But the creatures had seen the world differently since the first encounter. They had learned that humans outside the lab represented not just curiosity, but opportunity. An opportunity to explore, to understand, and perhaps to escape. The first act of the creature's plan was subtle. A small group worked together to manipulate a security mechanism, a task that would have been impossible without careful observation over centuries. The fox-like creature used its intelligence to distract a monitoring sensor, while the larger one positioned objects to unlock a door. The humans inside the lab noticed minor anomalies but dismissed them as equipment errors. The creatures had become masters of subtlety and patience. As days passed, the creatures tested the boundaries of their enclosures. They learned when humans were most likely to leave a room unattended, studied patterns of movement, and observed the weaknesses in the lab's security. Each successful test built confidence. The spark of rebellion was no longer just curiosity, it was a calculated effort to explore the world beyond the lab's walls. The humans were still unaware of the full extent of the subjects' capabilities. Dr. Reavers noted their intelligence, but she underestimated the depth of their adaptability. These creatures had survived 2 centuries of experimentation, learning not just from the tests but from each other. They had evolved mentally and emotionally, capable of cooperation, strategy, and foresight. The first encounter had awakened a new level of consciousness, a consciousness that would not be confined. The creatures began to communicate in ways humans could not understand. Subtle gestures, shared glances, and coordinated movements allowed them to plan together. The fox-like creature, the larger long-limbed one, and a few smaller subjects formed a group that observed every detail of the lab. They coordinated experiments of their own, testing doors, locks, and sensors. They were learning to use the environment against the humans, not violently, but intelligently. Then came the night of the first escape attempt. A storm raged outside, lightning flashing across the mountains. The humans were focused on their monitoring equipment, unaware that the creatures were taking advantage of the chaos. The fox-like creature squeezed through the small maintenance passage, the larger one following silently. Others joined carefully, moving through corridors and bypassing security systems. Every step had been planned, every action calculated over weeks of observation. Dr. Reavers and the lab scientists were alerted by minor alarms, but the storm had created disturbances that masked the true movement of the creatures. By the time they realized what was happening, the subjects had reached the outer chambers, near the exit to the mountains. It was a tense moment. The humans moved to intercept, but the creatures reacted faster than expected. The fox-like creature darted through small gaps, leading the others, while the larger one blocked potential barriers. Their intelligence and coordination had reached a level that surprised even the scientists who had studied them for years. Outside the lab, the storm raged, and the creatures experienced their first taste of freedom. The fox-like one paused, sniffing the fresh mountain air, feeling the wind on its fur. The larger creature stretched its limbs, adjusting to the new environment. For centuries, their lives had been confined to metal and glass, observed and tested. Now, they could move freely, explore, and experience the world beyond. The humans watched in awe and fear, realizing that these beings were no longer subjects. They were independent, intelligent, and unstoppable. Dr. Reevers quickly noted the implications. The lab had created extraordinary life forms, but it had underestimated their adaptability. The escape was not chaotic, it was a demonstration of intelligence, planning, and collaboration. These creatures had survived centuries of experimentation, evolved beyond expectations, and now faced the world outside with curiosity and caution. The encounter had become a revelation. The hidden lab had produced beings that could challenge humanity's understanding of intelligence and life itself. The creatures did not flee into the mountains blindly. They observed, tested, and adapted to the environment as they moved. The storm provided cover, but they relied on their intelligence to navigate safely. Each movement was deliberate, each decision calculated. For the humans, it was a humbling moment. They had studied, controlled, and monitored for centuries, but the outcome had exceeded their imagination. The subjects were no longer experiments, they were a new form of life, capable of thought, emotion, and action. As dawn broke, the storm cleared, revealing the vast expanse of mountains, forests, and rivers. The creatures paused, taking in the world they had only imagined. For centuries, they had been confined, observed, and tested. Now, they had the freedom to explore, to learn, and to grow. The humans remained at the lab's edge, realizing that history had shifted. The escape was not just physical, it was symbolic. The lab's legacy was no longer control, but revelation. Life, intelligence, and independence could not be contained forever. In the aftermath, the humans faced new questions. How would these creatures interact with the world? Could they communicate, coexist, or even teach humanity new things? The lab had always been a place of control, but the escape had transformed it into a story of discovery. The creatures had proven that intelligence, observation, and collaboration could overcome centuries of confinement. And in the hearts of the subjects, a new chapter had begun. They were free, aware, and ready to explore the world beyond. The storm had passed, but the consequences of their escape would ripple through both the hidden lab and the wider human world for years to come. For the humans, the revelation was clear. The creatures were not experiments anymore, they were beings of their own, capable of independent thought, curiosity, and perhaps even wisdom. For the creatures, the mountains and forests beyond the lab represented opportunity, adventure, and freedom. 2 centuries of secrecy had ended, and the story of life, intelligence, and discovery was only beginning. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains and forests in a calm, golden light. The hidden lab, once a place of control, secrecy, and centuries of experimentation, now stood quiet. Its doors, once a barrier, had been crossed, and its subjects, creatures shaped by human science and centuries of survival, were free. The world outside, vast and unexplored, awaited them. The fox-like creature paused on a ridge, looking down at the valleys below. Its fur glistened in the morning sun, and its blue eyes sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. For generations, it had known only the confines of metal and glass, routines, and the observation of humans. Now, the world stretched out endlessly, full of new sights, sounds, and experiences. It stepped forward cautiously, testing its agility, sniffing the air, and feeling the freedom that had been denied for 2 centuries. The larger, long-limbed creature emerged from the shadows, moving with a grace that belied its size. It had been trained, tested, and studied for centuries, but nothing had prepared it for the vastness of the mountains, the rustle of leaves in the wind, or the sound of rivers rushing below. Its mind, sharp and aware, catalogued every detail, every possible route, every potential danger. The lab had created intelligence, but the outside world would challenge it in new ways, ways that would further shape these extraordinary beings. Other creatures, smaller and nimble, began to explore in groups. They had communicated silently during the escape, and now, as free beings, they moved with purpose and coordination. Some climbed cliffs, others leapt from trees, and some lingered, observing humans who had followed cautiously from a distance. Every action demonstrated intelligence, curiosity, and adaptability. The centuries of experiments had given them not just survival skills but the ability to analyze, plan, and even anticipate. Dr. Reavers and her team watched from a safe distance, their hearts a mix of awe, fear, and excitement. The escape had transformed everything they knew about life and intelligence. These creatures were no longer subjects, they were independent beings, capable of thought, emotion, and action. Every observation they made was historic. Every movement of the creatures offered insight into minds that had developed far beyond human expectation. For the humans, the lab was a symbol of discovery and caution. 2 centuries of secrecy had ended, and they now faced a new reality. Life forms shaped by human science had evolved into something remarkable, something that could not be confined. Dr. Reavers realized that the implications were staggering. How would these creatures interact with the wider world? Could humanity learn from them? Could coexistence be possible? Every question carried weight, for the answers could change science, ethics, and the understanding of life itself. The creatures, meanwhile, continued to explore, each one learning in its own way. The fox-like creature discovered a stream, tasting the cool, fresh water, and learning its flow. The larger one tested the stability of a cliff edge, moving with careful calculation. Smaller creatures examined plants, rocks, and even insects, gathering knowledge in the way they had learned inside the lab. Their minds, honed by centuries of observation, now applied intelligence to the natural world. Every action was learning, every step growth. Despite their freedom, the creatures had not forgotten the lab or the humans inside it. Some returned occasionally to observe, to study patterns, or to understand human behavior. They had survived and learned from humans for centuries, and now, their intelligence allowed them to interact without fear or dependence. The relationship between human and creature had shifted from control to mutual observation, from testing to curiosity. The legacy of the lab was no longer oppression, it was discovery, evolution, and understanding. The humans began to adapt as well. Dr. Reavers documented every encounter, every movement, and every interaction. Her understanding of life, intelligence, and the possibilities of evolution expanded daily. She realized that humanity's knowledge was limited, and that these creatures could teach lessons no textbook or experiment ever could. The legacy of the lab extended beyond the creatures themselves. It was a challenge, a question, and an opportunity for humans to rethink their place in the natural world. As weeks passed, the creatures ventured further from the lab. They discovered forests, rivers, and caves. They learned to move silently, hunt carefully, and navigate new terrains. Their intelligence allowed them to adapt quickly, and their coordination ensured safety. Some of the creatures began to form groups, smaller communities that explored together, shared knowledge, and maintained a network of communication. The freedom that had once seemed unimaginable was now a reality, but with it came responsibility. They had to learn to survive, to grow, and to understand this new world. Dr. Reavers realized that the creatures' legacy would extend far beyond the mountains. The knowledge they carried, their intelligence, and their adaptability could redefine humanity's understanding of life. Scientists across the world could one day learn from them, and humans could gain insight into a form of intelligence that had evolved in isolation, shaped by observation, experimentation, and survival. The creatures were not just survivors, they were teachers, innovators, and pioneers. Yet the creatures remained mysterious. Even as they explored, they maintained a level of secrecy, avoiding unnecessary contact with humans. Their intelligence allowed them to make choices, to protect themselves, and to understand when interaction was safe or dangerous. The lab had given them skills, but the world beyond required wisdom. And in this balance, a new kind of story began, one of coexistence, learning, and mutual respect. The humans watched with awe as one of the fox-like creatures paused on a ridge, looking back at the lab, as if acknowledging its past. The lab had been its world for 200 years, but now it was merely a chapter in a larger story. The larger creature stood beside it, scanning the horizon, alert and thoughtful. Freedom had not only given them mobility but also perspective. They understood the humans, the lab, and now, the wider world. They were no longer subjects, they were beings of choice, capable of shaping their destiny. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over forests and rivers, the lab's legacy became clear. It was not the machines, the experiments, or even the humans who had created it. The true legacy was the creatures themselves, intelligent, adaptable, and aware. They had survived centuries of control, evolved in isolation, and now faced the world with curiosity and wisdom. The lab had created intelligence, but life had created freedom. Dr. Reavers and her team left the mountains with a new understanding. They had witnessed history, but they had also learned humility. Humanity's knowledge was vast, but these creatures reminded them that life's potential was far greater than confinement and control could ever reveal. The creature's story would continue, and humanity would follow, learning and observing, respecting the intelligence and independence of beings that had emerged from a hidden lab to explore the world beyond. In the quiet of the mountains, the creatures gathered on a high ridge, looking down at the forests and valleys below. The wind carried the scent of the outside world, the sound of rivers, and the promise of adventure. They had survived centuries, learned from humans, and adapted to their environment. Now, the world awaited them, vast and full of possibility. The lab was no longer their home, it was a memory, a stepping stone to a future of freedom, exploration, and discovery. And so, the story of the hidden lab came to an end, not with confinement or control, but with revelation, freedom, and legacy. The creatures had proven that intelligence, observation, and adaptation could not be contained. The humans had witnessed a new chapter of life, one that challenged everything they thought they knew. 2 centuries of secrecy had ended, but the story of the creatures, and their impact on the world, had only just begun. The hidden lab, silent and still, remained as a monument to human curiosity, scientific endeavor, and ethical challenge. But its true legacy lived in the creatures now exploring the mountains and forests, a testament to life's resilience, intelligence, and unyielding drive to grow, learn, and discover.